It wasn't unusual for Vanessa to text me. As my best friend Jake's girlfriend, she'd always been polite. Warm smiles at parties, quick check-ins when I wasn't around, the occasional casual exchange about movies or mutual friends. But this time, her message felt different. The notification lit up my phone just as I was settling onto the couch. "Can we talk? I need your advice about something." I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. It wasn't like Vanessa to reach out to me directly, at least not for something serious. The tone of the text, short and uncharacteristically formal, only added to the unease swirling in my chest. After a moment's hesitation, I typed back, "Sure. Everything okay?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Can I come over?" My heart skipped a beat. There was something urgent in her response, something that made it impossible to say no. I told her to come by, though the unease gnawed at me long after I hit send. Vanessa was beautiful in a way that seemed effortless, like she didn't realize the effect she had on people. Her dark hair always seemed to fall perfectly, even when she claimed it was a mess. Her smile, soft and slightly lopsided, had a way of drawing people in, making them feel like the center of her universe, if only for a moment. I'd always noticed her beauty. How could I not? But I'd buried those thoughts deep, locking them away in some far corner of my mind. She was off limits. Untouchable. So why was I so nervous about her coming over? When she knocked on my door that evening, I opened it to find her standing there, looking different. Her usual composure, the effortless confidence she carried like a second skin, was gone. Instead, she looked almost fragile, her dark eyes darting around like she was searching for the right words. "Vanessa," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "What's going on? Are you okay?" She nodded quickly, but it felt like a reflex, not an answer. "Yeah, I think so. Her voice trailed off as she walked into my apartment, her arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to hold something in. The tension in the air was immediate, thick, and oppressive. I closed the door behind her and gestured toward the couch. "Here, sit. Do you want water or anything?" She shook her head, her gaze darting toward me briefly before she dropped it to the floor. "No, I'm fine. Thanks." She sat down, her movements slow and deliberate, as if her body was as uncertain as her mind. I sat across from her, my pulse quickening. "What's going on?" I asked again, softer this time. "It's about Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The name hit me like a cold wind. Of course, this was about Jake. My best friend. Her boyfriend. I tried to push down the strange pang in my chest, a mix of guilt and something else I didn't want to name. "What about Jake?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening in the low light of the room. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted, her voice raw. I frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What do you mean? Did something happen?" Her lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came out. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, her gaze distant. "He's been distant," she said finally. "Not just lately. For a while now. It's like I'm losing him." The vulnerability in her voice was like a punch to the gut. Vanessa, who always seemed so put together, so sure of herself, now sat in front of me, unraveling. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to offer comfort, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth was, I had no idea what was going on with Jake. He hadn't mentioned any problems, hadn't given any hint that things were off between them. "Vanessa," I began, but she cut me off. "Do you think he's tired of me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Her words sent a jolt through me, and before I could think, I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "That's not it." "How do you know?" she pressed, her eyes searching mine desperately. "Because," I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Because you're amazing, Vanessa. Anyone can see that. Jake included." Her expression softened, but her eyes didn't leave mine. The room felt too quiet, too still, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me. "You really think so?" she asked, her voice soft, almost fragile. I nodded, my throat tightening. "Of course I do." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the walls of the room had closed in. Her eyes lingered on mine, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she leaned forward, her knee brushing against mine. My breath hitched. I told myself it was nothing, just a simple movement, but the electricity that shot through me was undeniable. "You always know what to say," she murmured, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Her hand moved then, resting lightly on my arm. The touch was warm, deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my mind racing. The closeness of her, the way her eyes flicked to my lips. It was overwhelming, disorienting. "Vanessa," I said softly, my voice trembling. But she didn't pull away. Her gaze stayed locked on mine, her touch lingering as if daring me to stop her. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I could. I tried to focus on her words, to stay present, to listen like a good friend should. But it was nearly impossible with her sitting so close. The subtle press of her knee against mine sent a quiet jolt through my body, as if every nerve had been set on edge. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, floral with a warm, earthy undertone, and it was doing nothing to help my concentration. Vanessa's voice was soft, raw as she spoke, her usual poise unraveling with every word. "It's like, he's here, but he's not here, you know," she said, her gaze flitting between her hands and mine. "I can feel him pulling away, and I don't know if it's me. If I'm the problem." The way her voice cracked on that last sentence hit me hard. I'd never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so unsure of herself. Vanessa had always been this untouchable figure in my mind, someone who carried herself with grace and confidence. Seeing her this way, stripped of all that armor, made her feel human. "Do you think he's tired of me?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. Her eyes glistened as she turned to look at me, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. The question hit me like a punch to the chest. The idea of Jake, my best friend, growing tired of Vanessa seemed absurd. How could anyone get tired of her? But her pain was real, and I could see how much it was eating at her. I couldn't let her spiral into self-doubt, not when I knew better. "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the thick silence. "That's not it." She blinked, her eyes wide and searching as they locked onto mine. "How do you know?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because the truth felt so heavy on my tongue. "Jake, he's not always great at showing how he feels. He's not the kind of guy who wears his heart on his sleeve. But trust me, Vanessa, he cares about you. He's just him." She nodded slowly, as if she was trying to absorb my words, but there was still doubt etched into her features. Her vulnerability lingered in the air, thick and tangible, and I found myself desperate to say something that would take that pain away. "And you're amazing," I added, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Anyone can see that, Jake included. You're smart, kind, beautiful." My voice faltered slightly on the last word, but I kept going. "You're the kind of person people don't forget, Vanessa." Her eyes searched mine again, but this time there was something different in her gaze, something quieter, deeper. It was the kind of look that makes you feel like someone is peeling back all your layers and seeing the things you try to hide. "You really think so?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost shy. My pulse quickened, and I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. "Of course I do." For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen faded into the background, the world outside the apartment ceasing to exist. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears and the quiet, uneven rhythm of her breathing. Then out of nowhere, Vanessa leaned closer. The movement was subtle at first, hesitant, but it was impossible to miss. Her hand lifted, resting lightly on my arm, and my entire body tensed under her touch. "You always know what to say," she murmured, her voice low, intimate. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment before flicking downward, to my lips. The room tilted, or maybe it was just me. The heat of her hand on my arm, the closeness of her face, the way her voice curled around me like a warm blanket. It was too much. My mind raced, a flood of thoughts battling for dominance. This is Vanessa, Jake's girlfriend. She's vulnerable. She needs comfort, not this. But there was another thought, quieter but more insistent. You've wanted this. "Vanessa," I said softly, her name trembling on my lips like a warning or a plea. Her gaze snapped back to mine, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. Guilt, longing, a storm of emotions that mirrored my own. Her hand tightened ever so slightly on my arm, and her presence overwhelmed me, filling every corner of my mind. She leaned in just a fraction closer, her breath warm against my cheek, and my heart stuttered, caught somewhere between panic and desire. It felt like the entire universe had narrowed to this moment, this tiny space between us. I should have stopped her. I knew that, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I froze, every nerve in my body caught between instinct and paralysis. A voice inside me screamed at me to move, to back away before the moment spiraled any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. Her touch, the warmth of her hand on my arm and the closeness of her body. It was overwhelming. My head was spinning, And no matter how hard I tried to think clearly, everything else faded except her. "Vanessa, I don't think," I started, my voice barely audible, shaking under the weight of the emotions swirling between us. But then her hand moved, tentative and soft, to cup my cheek. The contact sent a jolt through me, every nerve coming alive as her thumb brushed lightly against my skin. My breath hitched, my words faltering. "I know this is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes met mine, and I could see it all there. The guilt, the longing, the conflict tearing her apart as much as it was tearing me. But I can't help it. Her admission cracked something inside me, breaking through the wall I'd been trying so hard to keep intact. The logical part of me, the one that knew this was a betrayal of Jake, my best friend, the person who trusted me most, was shouting at me to stop, to pull away, to end this before it crossed a line we couldn't come back from. But there was another part of me, buried deep but always there, that wanted this. That had wanted this for months, no matter how much I tried to deny it. "Vanessa," I whispered again, but the rest of the sentence never came. She leaned in, closing the small distance between us, her lips brushing against mine. It was the barest touch, tentative and unsure, as if she was testing the boundaries, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss ignited something inside me, a spark that quickly became an all-consuming fire. The tension that had simmered between us for months, every unspoken feeling, every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, exploded to the surface. Her lips pressed against mine more firmly, and I felt my body respond instinctively, my hands finding her waist as if they'd been waiting for this moment all along. The kiss deepened, a mixture of urgency and hesitation, as though we both knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. Her fingers slid into my hair, and I felt her breath hitch as she pressed closer. My mind was a storm, torn between the searing intensity of the moment and the crushing weight of what it meant. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my chest rising and falling as I tried to process what had just happened. The air between us was heavy, charged with everything we hadn't said, but had just felt. "Vanessa," I started again, my voice shaking, barely more than a whisper. "We can't." I couldn't finish the sentence. The words felt hollow, meaningless against the reality of what had just happened. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it, and every inch of my skin still tingled where her hands had touched me. She looked at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just raw emotion, stripped bare and laid out between us. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I know we can't. But I needed this." Her words hung in the air, fragile but unshakable. I swallowed hard, my throat tight as I searched her face for answers to questions I couldn't even bring myself to ask. "I needed to feel something real," she continued, her voice breaking. She looked down, her hands falling away from me, as if realizing for the first time what we'd done. I felt so lost, so numb. And being here with you, it's the first time I've felt anything in so long. The weight of her confession settled heavily in my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I wanted to say something, to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But how could I, when I didn't even know if that was true? The guilt came rushing in then, sharp and suffocating. Jake's face flashed in my mind, his easy smile, the way he always laughed when he talked about Vanessa. He trusted me. He trusted her. And we'd both betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from the weight of what had just happened. "I shouldn't have." She didn't finish, and she didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. I stood too, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. "Vanessa," I said softly, but she shook her head. "It's okay," she said quickly, her voice wavering. "You don't have to say anything. I should go." Before I could stop her, she turned and headed for the door, leaving me standing there, my hands still tingling with the memory of her touch. The sound of the door closing echoed in the quiet apartment, and I was left alone, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me like a tidal wave. I sank back onto the couch, my head in my hands, the reality of the moment crashing over me. I knew everything had changed now, between Vanessa, Jake, and me. And no matter how much I wished I could take it back, there was no undoing what had just happened. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of half-spoken truths and quiet confessions. We sat on the couch, the tension between us no longer the sharp, electric charge it had been moments earlier, but something heavier, more complicated. Vanessa spoke first, her voice hesitant, almost fragile. I know what we did was wrong, she began, her gaze fixed on her hands resting in her lap. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel anymore. Her words hit me like a blow, raw and unfiltered. I wanted to look away, to shield myself from the weight of her emotions, but I couldn't. She deserved to be heard, even if I wasn't ready for what she was about to say. How long? I asked quietly, my throat tight. How long have you felt this? Her lips parted, but it took her a moment to respond. Months, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me then, her dark eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. It's not like I planned it, okay? It just happened. The more time I spent around you, the more she trailed off, shaking her head. I swallowed hard, my hands clenched tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Vanessa, I don't expect you to feel the same, she interrupted, her voice trembling. I mean, maybe I do. I don't know. She let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through her hair. I'm so confused, and I feel like I'm losing myself, and Her voice cracked, and I instinctively reached for her hand, my fingers brushing against hers in a way that felt both natural and entirely forbidden. Vanessa, stop, I said gently. You're not alone in this. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, the silence between us felt deafening. I could see the storm of emotions swirling in her expression, relief, disbelief, guilt, all colliding at once. You're not, she asked, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, the weight of my next words pressing down on me like 1,000 pounds. No, I admitted finally. I felt it too. For a long time. Her breath hitched, and I watched as her hand tightened slightly against mine, as though she were clinging to my words. What are we supposed to do now? She asked, her voice breaking on the last word. I didn't have an answer. I sat there, searching her face, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say out loud. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that we'd figure it out, but the truth was, I didn't know if we could. We talked for what felt like hours, our words tangling together in a messy, emotional knot. She told me how distant Jake had been, how she'd started to feel invisible in her own relationship, and how that had only made her feelings for me harder to ignore. I told her about the guilt I'd carried for months, the way I'd pushed down my own emotions out of loyalty to Jake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. It was messy, complicated, impossible to untangle. By the time Vanessa finally stood to leave, the weight of everything we'd said, and everything we hadn't, pressed heavily on my chest. I followed her to the door, my stomach churning as I watched her slip on her coat. This doesn't change anything, she said softly, her eyes downcast. Jake. And you're still his best friend. Her words were meant to be final, but they only left me feeling more conflicted. I nodded anyway, unable to trust my voice. Vanessa hesitated in the doorway, her hand lingering on the frame as she turned back to look at me. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. For what? I asked, my brow furrowing. For making me feel seen, she said simply, before stepping out into the night. I stood by the window long after she left, watching her figure retreat into the darkness. My chest felt hollow, my thoughts a whirlwind of regret and longing and guilt. I knew deep down that everything between Jake and me, between all of us, had changed forever. The next time I saw Jake, the guilt was suffocating. He was his usual self, all easy smiles and casual jokes, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Dude, you okay? He asked at one point, his brows knitting together in concern. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile that I knew didn't quite reach my eyes. Vanessa wasn't there, and her absence was like a ghost haunting every word I spoke. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting her to walk in, her smile lighting up the room. But she didn't, and the emptiness she left behind felt heavier with every passing minute. I tried to act normal, to laugh at Jake's jokes and talk about meaningless things, but my mind kept drifting. To her, to the weight of her hand on mine, the way her voice cracked when she said she felt invisible, the way her lips had lingered against mine like a secret she couldn't keep anymore. I don't know where this will lead, if anywhere. I don't know if Vanessa will tell Jake, or if I should, or if this will become a secret we bury deep and never speak of again. All I know is that one impulsive moment has left me questioning everything, my loyalty, my desires, and whether the lines I thought I'd never cross were just illusions all along. And now, I can't stop wondering, what happens when the truth finally catches up to us?